or should I say, arr. One thing I'd like to start with is by worrying a little bit about what the word free means in the concept of free will, because it has different meanings for different people in different parts of the sciences. And one way to diffuse a lot of the confusion on this concept is to look to the brilliant work of the late Hannah Arendt, one of the greatest social psychologists of the 20th century, although she was a political philosopher. She has written and analyzed the history of the concept of free will and has pointed out some very important things, such as the ancient Greeks, with all of their brilliant philosophizing, had no concept of free will. It wasn't an issue for them. Their concept of freedom was political. It was about action. It was about free action in society. Free for them meant freedom from external control, from external influences and constraints. Political science, as she noted, as a field wouldn't even exist without this concept of free will and free association, because it's the study of that. The psychological free will, on the other hand, was originally a Christian concept. She traces it first to St. Paul in the letter to the Romans. And St. Paul discovered the will in its weakness, or his weakness, to do right. Sort of like the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He said, I know what to do, I know what is right, but sometimes I can't do it. And then he exhorted his followers to try harder, to work harder, to do the right thing when it was hard to do. And that's the first mention of this idea of the will in philosophy or anywhere else. Now, St. Augustine elaborated 600 years later and really developed the idea of free will. St. Paul discovered the will, Augustine discovered free will. Augustine argued that free will must exist because there's otherwise no basis for God's judgment on us. Assignment by God to heaven or hell would otherwise be arbitrary and unfair. Augustine argued that psychological free will must exist, because otherwise God would be doing something arbitrarily. It's therefore a theological solution to the problem of evil, which was a very important problem of the time and still is. How could an all-good God permit evil to exist in the world? Augustine's solution was, God is not the source of evil, but must allow for its possibility, must permit it in man and women, in order to judge our lives fairly and enable us to earn our eternal reward. The concept of free will as internal free will, or internal causation, is thus a religious concept. So just to clarify and summarize so far, as opposed to the political concept of free will, which means freedom from external control, the psychological concept of free will holds that our will is free from internal control. Now, Augustine couldn't know, of course, about the future concepts of 1,200 years later of evolution and natural selection. Christianity believed in the creation of life forms de novo, existing at today's present time as they did forever in the past. It was Darwin, with his decades of painstaking documentation and research on transitional forms of life based on the fossil record and other evidence, the development of some species in some places and not other places, and the fossil record existing there and no other place. This catastrophically undermined the fundamental premise of creation de novo, and linked us forever to the rest of the animal world. We were no longer special in that sense. So according to Darwin, human behavioral tendencies were shaped by natural selection, which only operates on overt behavioral responses, meaning that human behavior is at least partly determined by our genetic heritage. However, the rate of genetic change is too slow for direct genetic controls for behavior to adapt quickly enough to the changing environment that takes place at the same time. So for an adaptive situation, for an adaptive arrangement, genes must rely on local agents as proxies to carry out their agenda. And there's a great deal of consensus in the natural science, as well as philosophy. Evolutionary biologists, evolutionary psychologists, eminent philosophers of science, and names are given there of just some of them, all speak of motivations and goal programs as the crucial link between genetic influences from the deep past and adaptive behavior in the present-day environment. Another important point is that purposive behavior, such as motivation and goal pursuit, is widespread among living organisms. Even single-cell paramecia have them. approach and avoidance motivations. In humans and our ancestors, conscious mental processes were relatively late evolutionary development, and there's lots of evidence on this detailed in books by Terry Deacon, Dan Dennett, Merlin Donald, and others. Among the evidence, the anthropological evidence, is the sudden and dramatic increase in brain size, which happened concurrently with the first emergence of cultural symbols, cultural evidence, such as cave art, tool use, and so forth. So consciousness was relatively late evolutionary development. Now that means that adaptive unconscious processes had to exist before then to guide our behavior adaptively so that we didn't become extinct. Natural selection operates incrementally. It doesn't replace the entire system with some new system, but works and cobbles together organically on what already exists. Thus, it's very likely that according to this logic, you make the prediction that conscious motivation on other behavioral guidance processes would make use of the pre-existing unconscious motivational machinery. And this analysis would lead to the prediction that we should see great similarity between conscious and unconscious modes of goal pursuit, both in terms of the outcomes they produce, but also in the underlying processes and any other phenomenal qualities. This turns out to be true. We didn't know it 10 years ago, but we know it today, that all of these things are similar. The activation of the goal can be unconscious, its operation can be entirely unconscious, and by that I mean unintentional and without the person's awareness of it operating. Unconsciously pursued goals produce the same outcomes as do conscious pursuit of the same goal. When a goal is unconsciously pursued, you get the same qualities Lewin identified for conscious goal pursuit, such as persistence, resumption, and self-evaluation, changes in efficacy, changes in self-efficacy, changes in motivational strength, based on feedback from the environment, causing some goals to become stronger and some weaker, all without the person's conscious involvement. That means a goal perpetuation over a person's lifetime. The ones that continue and the ones that drop out can be an entirely unconscious process. In fact, the most recent motivational science and motivational neuroscience research is showing that the same underlying brain regions are involved in conscious and unconscious goal pursuit. And the same behavioral outcomes are produced in these regions with or without conscious awareness. For example, I don't have time to get into the detail of these studies, but you can see them, Bisiglione et al. From the Chris Frith lab at UCL in London. Imaging study of motivation-relevant brain regions shows that you get the same effects of an incentive stimulus presented subliminally or supraliminally, doesn't matter, on the outcome of exertion on a task, greater exertion for greater incentive. They also show that the same specific basal forebrain region becomes active in both cases, whether or not the person is aware of this incentive or not. And I think more dramatically is the work of Henk Arts, Ruud Kusters, and their colleagues at Utrecht. And they have several papers, a wonderful JPSP in 2005, and a science article that came out last March of 2008. They subliminally activated both the goal itself and the incentive. And as you see that red line, the greatest goal pursuit, the strongest goal pursuit, occurred when both an incentive, a positive reward incentive, and the goal itself were activated outside of awareness. So you can operate the machinery entirely unconsciously. The same brain regions are involved. And this evidence is just emerging in neuroscience. So as I said before, as consciousness was a relatively late evolutionary development, adaptive unconscious processes had to exist before then, of course, and natural selection occurs incrementally, with new processes building on or exapting existing processes if all possible. And that means that conscious motivational or guidance processes likely made use of existing unconscious motivational machinery. So it's the conscious processes that are making use of what was pre-existing. And they do this in many different ways. Through evaluation, through emotions, triggering motivations, as in Jennifer Lerner's work, evaluations triggering approach and avoidance motivations immediately, perceptions of other people's behavior, even abstract concepts like stereotypes, directly, unconsciously linked to behavioral tendencies. All of these systems are linked to behavioral tendencies, which is exactly what you'd predict if they were an adaptation based on natural selection, because natural selection only works on overt behavior. These things are not just automatic processes going around in our head and causing us to feel or think certain things. They're all directly linked to behavior, as would be predicted by this evolutionary analysis. Now, as I've been saying, conscious processes, therefore, given the late evolutionary development, had to make use of existing unconscious motivational machinery. against some claims that have been made recently. For example, that priming effects or unconscious processes are really like hot wiring a car. That what we're doing is we're producing the same effects as through conscious processes, but we all know that's not the normal way you start a car. Someone else sitting next to me said this just a couple of years ago in a New York Times interview. So it's a common thing you hear that it's priming or unconscious processes hot wiring a car, but it's actually the other way around. It's conscious processes that came later, which are hot wiring the pre-existing unconscious machinery that developed over eons. And now, as we've seen in some recent articles, there are people in this room who have been publishing articles arguing against doing science or doing research on free will and drawing conclusions about free will. We should not draw conclusions about free will or the existence because there's negative consequences of doing so. People will then act immorally or unethically. This is seen as dangerous knowledge, and I guess the implication here is we shouldn't be doing this research. Interestingly to me, this is very similar to an old argument about religion and morality. That is, without religion, that is, without the threat of eternal punishment, maybe the lure of eternal reward. Hell is a stronger motivator, I think. But without that, people would have no reason to behave morally or ethically, without religion. There's new research coming out of John Joe's lab and other places on differences between conservatives and liberals. And the conservatives and liberals are found to differ in their answer to or filling in the rest of the sentence. If God did not exist, what would happen? Conservatives tend to answer this question by saying society would collapse and there would be no morality. Liberals with a different existential concern than what would be the meaning of life. Notice what happens if you substitute the word free will for God. The concept of free will is a religious concept. It's not a scientific concept. Now, just this month, February 2009, is publication of an article by Roy and colleagues, again arguing that there's negative consequences for disbelief in free will. It increases aggression and reduces helpfulness. I just want to point out that this research is being funded by the Templeton Foundation, which is an organization, a foundation, promoting religion in society, promoting the benefits of religion, for example, pro-sociality. There is an agenda here. Now, am I upset? Am I angry? Arr! Arr! No. Because they don't have free will. They're not responsible for what they're doing. And I hate to do this, but I need to quote some scripture to you. These are the first words of Jesus Christ on the cross. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Now, I want to leave this on here for just a second because look at the titles of these two articles and look at the research that was done. If you don't believe in free will, you cheat. If you don't believe in free will, then you are aggressive and you're not as helpful. Where's the research looking at possibly the positive benefits of disbelief in free will? For example, forgiveness and compassion. Doesn't Jesus say right here? He asks his Father to forgive them because they don't know what they do. Could it be, if research looked there, research hasn't, for some reason research is looking at the negative consequences? It reminds me a lot about the bad old days for me, when everyone thought that automatic processes were evil because they were responsible for addictions and drug abuse and spouse abuse and everything else. And that's all people thought. And Tori Higgins and I used to write chapters, trying to point out that, hey, it's a 2x2. There's good aspects of consciousness and there's bad. There's good aspects of the unconscious and there's bad. But the research seems to be looking for the bad things. And again, there's maybe reasons for that. research is, it's not really that new. Don't we already know this? Don't we already know that people have positive illusions? Don't we already know that people believe they're better than average, but that everyone believes that, but that can't possibly be true? Did society collapse when Shelley Taylor wrote her book and published it? It was a bestseller for basic books in 1989. Creative self-deception and the healthy mind, positive illusions. Is society now all depressed because they read Shelley Taylor's book? And because these things are perhaps might cause a person to become depressed or maybe a bit antisocial or whatever, it still, of course, doesn't change the fact that these are illusions. It doesn't change the fact that these things are not true. We're not all better than average. This is an old story. Galileo, displacing the earth as the center of the universe, was put in house arrest by the Catholic Church. People didn't want to hear it. Darwin, although he was careful not to include humans in the animals he discussed in The Origin, published exactly 150 years ago now, nonetheless was pointing out that we weren't created special. We were evolved from the animals that we thought we were different from. Sigmund Freud, our consciousness is not the only director of what we do. There's this unconscious of which we don't know and can't control or don't really know much about. And Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, with the selfish gene. We're not even the unit of natural selection as individuals. It's the genes inside of us that are using us as vessels for the propagation into the next generation. As Ned Flanders said to Lisa Simpson when they discovered the fossil of that angel outside of Springfield, there are things we don't want to know. Important things. And Dawkins addresses this, especially if you read the forward to the latest new edition of The Selfish Genes that's coming out a few years ago. And the kinds of letters and things he got back then in the 70s. Yeah, people were really depressed. They were saying how bleak, how horrible. People would reproach him for his students reading his book and coming to him in tears. Life is empty and purposeless. And he said, apologetically, if something is true, no amount of wishful thinking can undo it. He said other things. It's really worth reading that move forward. So let's look at the effect of this knowledge. Let's take, for example, let's start with Galileo. Okay, the Earth is not the center of the universe. It's not that the sun goes around the Earth. It's that the Earth is going around the sun. Now, I don't know, any of you look out your hotel window at 7:30 this morning, and what did you see? Did you see, oh, hey, look, the Earth is tilting and rotating towards the sun, making it come into the sky? No, we see the sun rising in the east. I still do. That's how I experience it. That's how I'm made to experience it. It's part of our Constitution. That's how we see things. The sun is rising in the east. It still does for me. It sets in the west, by the way. Galileo didn't change that. He didn't change how we perceive and experience the world at all. Although we know how the universe works now, and we all accept that, it doesn't change our phenomenal experience. It's been 150 years since Darwin, since The Origin was published, and 30 years or more since The Selfish Gene was published. Enormous impact. The science of evolution is unquestioned. Much more than exists in psychology on free will or not. It's been 150 years since this knowledge has been out there. What has been the effect on people? Well, wow. Big effect, huh? 90% of Americans believe in God, and around the world most people do. A recent CNN Time poll, this is just a few days ago actually, 59% believe in the literal truth of the apocalypse and the final judgment. There it is, the original 4 horsemen right down there. 2005 New York Times survey, 2/3 of Americans believe creationism should be taught alongside evolution. 1 out of 6 United States public school science teachers believe in creationism. Science teachers in the United States. How much impact on daily life have these people had? Should we really be worried about drawing conclusions about free will or determinism in in social psychology. Worried about the effects on people. And the reason is that there's so many supports for our belief in free will and agency. Dan Wegner has outlined them in his brilliant book, The Illusion of Conscious Will. And the subsequent research he and his colleagues have been doing on agency and why we feel agency and why we believe in it. Paul Bloom has done another separate brilliant analysis on people as natural-born dualists. When we're infants, everything is, we don't know what's causing everything. Everything seems magical. It's mysterious. We don't know what's going on. We just accept it the way it is. The world is fun. It's full of magic and things we can't explain. We still have that belief today. I don't know who, I think Joachim Kruger's research on superstition, when you make people think about something bad happening and watch what they do, 60% of them surreptitiously knock on the table. They knock on wood. 60% of college students do that. So it's ingrained in us. There's so much support for this belief. It's not going to change anything, and certainly it hasn't, if we're still teaching creationism in the public schools. And we still believe the sun rises, and not the earth is tilting towards it. Now, I think social psychologists are especially prone to these worries because we have two different motivations for being social psychologists, and they can come into conflict. One is social change, a very important one. We want to improve society. We want to solve society's problems. We want to help people. Look at positive psychology. We want to help people be happy. I'm not a big fan of positive psychology, I'll admit, because there's a desired outcome for the research. That's not science. And the Templeton Foundation is a big supporter of positive psychology, by the way. There's another reason, that's a search for truth. That's where I started. That's why I wanted to go into this field. I wanted to be a scientist. That's what I always wanted to be. And when I read B.S. Skinner's book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, being raised Irish Catholic, going to Mass early in the morning, 6 days a week for most of my childhood, it was a big conflict in me. How could this be true? This seems to say that there's no God. I wanted to study that. That's my motivation. And you can see I'm a little emotional when I see articles being published, being accepted by reviewers and editors and published saying we shouldn't study it. There's bad things that will happen if you do. So yeah, it's a little personal. And so as far as my full disclosure, it's a little personal. Now look, as someone recently said to me, we wouldn't be having this debate in any other field. We wouldn't be even talking about this issue in other sciences. There's lots of stuff showing that economists, the faculty of economics around the country give the least amount to charity. Of all the departments in universities, it's economists who give the least amount to charity. Now, no one's saying get rid of economics. Let's not study economics. Well, maybe except the author of this book. And there's another argument that's raised, and that's, hey, you know, this issue's been debated by philosophers for a long time, thousands of years or 1,500 years, and there's no resolution. Yeah, it's because it's been in philosophy with thought experiments, with reason and logic. As Anthony Gottlieb pointed out in his wonderful book on the history of science, even though it doesn't say that in the title, it's really the history of science, and how science has branched off from philosophy historically, only when methods developed to study them scientifically. So there wasn't astronomy until a telescope, there wasn't chemistry until a microscope, there wasn't cognitive psychology until a computer. We can reaction times, subliminal presentation stimuli, all the nice things we can do with computers. We've only recently developed a methodology to study these things scientifically. Why stop now? Why? I think we should all ask, those of us who want to stop should ask themselves why. I don't think we should. I'm not going to stop. I think everyone knows I'm not going to stop. I think the issue here is you. Yeah. You guys. And here's another reason. Just because, let's say all academic university psychologists stop doing research on free will, on causation and trying to get people to do things without their knowledge. Does that mean it's going to stop? No, it's very naive, very naive. Government figure, they know what the buttons to press. They know, from their own methods, they know that fear ads cause a preference for the status quo. So making people afraid is a way to get people to keep electing incumbents. Companies spend a lot of money on research and trying to get people to do what they want them to do, buy their products or whatever. A lot of money, a lot more than we get for our research. And they're doing that research, and they're not publishing it in JPSP and PSPB. They're not giving it away for free. It's proprietary knowledge, and they're using it to increase their profits. We're the only ones out there who are doing this for free, and we're doing it for everybody else. We've got to get the knowledge out about how these things work to the general public. It's the only chance they have to control it themselves. If we don't do it, then we're leaving it in the hands of Karl Rove and the Marlboro Man. As this Fortune told me the other day, I mean, I got this Fortune 3 months ago, really. It's a genuine Fortune from a fortune cookie. If you do not run your subconscious mind yourself, someone else will.
Can't believe that.
And finally, if you really think about it, this shouldn't be that much of a problem for us. You know, what makes you you? You know, when you ask people these questions, you know, I'm brown eyes, I come from Illinois, I'm white, or I'm black, or I'm Asian, I'm European ancestry, I'm Irish American, I come from, you know, all these kinds of things. None of these have we had any personal responsibility for. But look at all the name-letter effect research, you know, how someone who shares the letters of your name, totally arbitrary. You didn't pick your name. They share your name, you like them, and you know, dentists go to live in, dentists become dentists, and Ken go to live in Kentucky and Florence. People named Florence live in Florida, all these kinds of name-letter effect. Shared birthday effects, just hearing someone shares your birthday. You didn't choose, you didn't know what day it was when you were born. I think I'll wait another couple of weeks. I like February 18th better. You didn't do that. You had no control over it. So Brian Erb and I have just looked at the 20 statements test in the introductory psychology pool at Yale. Just looked at the answers that people gave when you're asked, who am I? And you get things like, I'm a brother, I'm from Ohio, I'm tall, I'm a male, I'm from Minnesota, I'm blue eyes, I'm a student, I'm an athlete, I'm a Yankees fan. Some things that they did have control over and many things that they didn't. In fact, if you look at the number of uncontrolled things that they think that come out first, like Tori Higgins showed, the things people give first are the most important, most accessible to them in their identity. A third, depending on how you count, you can be conservative or liberal in how you code these things. It's all in the 30s, the .30. But a third are things that you have nothing to do with. We admire attractive people. Did they have anything to do with that? Look at Matthew's baby boy. He looks just like his dad. Oh boy, he's going to be a movie star too someday. The way Hollywood works, he didn't choose his looks. He has no personal responsibility. Those of us who are not as good looking as Matthew McConaughey or Jessica Alba, is it our fault? Do we wail and gnash our teeth in anguish because of that? But we still admire them. We still like to look at them. We still like to watch TMZ, and we like to look at gossip columns and everything else, and hear all about these people and their beautiful babies. They have nothing to do with it. It's your will. Whether it's free or not, it's yours. Look at our new hero, Chelsea Sullenberger, the pilot who crash-landed the plane into the Hudson River and saved all those lives, who went back and forth to make sure everybody was out of that plane before he left himself. And the most recent thing, just in the news today, is that remember, he left a book on the plane that was due at the Danville, California Public Library. And he wrote them a letter saying, I'm sorry, could I get an extension? What a guy. He's my hero. He's a hero. I don't care if he had free will when he did it. In fact, look at the title of this article from the Toledo Blade just two days ago. He's a thin slices hero. These guys read Malcolm Gladwell. He didn't have time to make decisions. He wasn't thinking. He was just reacting, doing what his training, his life had prepared him to do. And he's a hero. And I admire him whether or not there's free will. Because he's him. Could anybody else? Maybe not. How many other people could have done what he did? And if you listen to the tapes of the cockpit tapes when this was happening, so calm, so in control. So, no, I can't go to Teterboro, don't have time. No, I'm sorry, can't go. No, runway 3, sorry. Looks like the river. And one last thing I'd like all of you to keep in mind is, for people who say that we should not make conclusions about free will, there's a shifting target here. The same ones who are saying that we should not talk about free will or make conclusions about free will are very free about making conclusions about the existence of something called the agentic self. And And if you read what the definition of the agentic self is, it seems a whole lot like free will to me. And this is certainly continuing today. It's certainly a big part of some models of self-regulation and emerging in a big way in this new field called motivational science. It's free will, just by another name. So we're not supposed to do research and make conclusions about free will, but it's okay to talk about the agentic self. I'm running out of time, but we have papers on our website. Julie Wang and I have some papers under review, analyzing all the ways in which the agentic self really isn't in control. It's the currently active goal, the proxy of the evolved motives, and so forth. There's lots of evidence on this side. There's lots of reasons to believe this. One of the best is the research on moral credentials, where people who do something good are then unlikely to do the same thing, or less likely to do it right afterwards. This is called a goal turn-off effect. Goals, when they're done, turn off for a while. Now, this goes against what the self would do. This goes against self-values. This goes against what the self would supposedly want to do. Look at the bottom one there, the most recent one. Supporters of Barack Obama before the election were given a chance to give their support for the candidate. If they were given a chance to express their support for Barack, they're afterwards less likely than control participants to advocate funding for African-American causes. Does that sound like the self, and the self is in control, and the self is guiding behavior? It's the active goal. Just like Dawkins said, it's not us. We're not the unit of natural selection. It's the gene. So again, it's not the self. It's the goal. So we promised Constantine that we would say a little bit about what consciousness is for. And we've come a long way in terms of what we can say consciousness is for, mainly by the process of subtraction. People like Bandura, Michelle, and others were saying for a long time, even as much as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, that everything is pretty much under control of consciousness and conscious intention, awareness, and guidance. This is pretty standard in these models of motivation. Well, that's not true. We know that that's dropped off. There's the incredible shrinking consciousness here going on. There's no necessary role for consciousness in all of these things, including flexible responses to the changing environment. Ron Haskin's work on unconscious achievement motivation doing very well with the Wisconsin card sorting task. The task where you have to shift your rule based on feedback and not just do the reflexive routine thing, habitual thing. Gordon Moskowitz's work and Kai Sassenberg's work on creativity. If that's the name of the game is to come up with creative, unusual answers, the unconscious achievement motive does that too. It's giving the less habitual, because that's what's needed in this task. Not the most habitual, not the reflexive, rigid response. And there are some new leads. For example, interpersonal coordination. If you read Herb Clark's wonderful book on using language from 10 years ago, that we need consciousness. We need to have a sort of an open kind of workspace to deal with people, because we have maybe automatic unconscious processes in ourselves, but we don't know right away what other people are going to do. We have to be able to create some kind of common ground with them. However, there's new research, Josh Ackerman and others are showing that there are, for example, that ego depletion effects are contagious to someone watching someone make decisions. They also experience ego depletion. So there's reasons to believe there are these collaborative coordination structures that have evolved or that exist innately. So maybe that's going to drop off the table too. Merlin Donald, I think, is still on there, that consciousness is a workspace to create new unconscious processes. He calls them creating your own demons. And that does seem to be something that you can only do with conscious processes. Again, maybe that'll drop off someday. Planning for the future, coming up with a plan of what to do next. Richard Byrne, who's a primatologist from Scotland, has shown that this is also seems to distinguish the key thing that distinguishes human beings from other primates. So planning and constructing plans for the future, this may well be what consciousness is for. But consciousness, folks, is not the same as free will. And the Four Horsemen were up there a little while ago. I've been saying that for a long time. They're not isomorphic concepts. To say there's no free will is not to say that consciousness doesn't exist. So in closing, because I'm getting kicked off right now, my time is up. I want to say that, yeah, we have a choice. You know, we have to watch out for these two motivations we have. And we have to be careful that the one motivation that we want to find something to be true doesn't influence our other motivation, and that is finding what is true. Daryl Bem once gave a talk at the NYU Law School when I was still at NYU. And there was a question from the the audience, and he was talking about the different factors that cause someone to do something, and someone stood up and said, what do you mean all these factors that cause someone to do something? What about free will? And Daryl said, and I wrote it down, I don't believe in free will. I'm a social psychologist. I believe in causes. And I'll tell you something, I told him this, I gave a talk at Cornell a few months ago, and I told him in person, that was one of the proudest moments of my life. Thank you.